to to talk about philosophy of education. So I believe that some of you have attended the symposium the other day, so you probably will know Michael and Laura. Okay? But for those of you who do not know Michael, I will do the introduction. Okay, so Michael Hand is Professor of Philosophy of Education at the University of Birmingham, and he is also the adjunct professor at the University of Hong Kong. So he edits the Bloomsbury Philosophy of Education book series and co-edits the Journal of Philosophy in Schools. Michael's research interests are in the areas of moral, political, religious, and philosophical education. His books include The Theory of Moral Education, which I have been using in my class, Ethics and Experience Essays in honor of Richard Brigg, Pastoralism in Schools and Philosophy in Schools. So today Michael's talk will be centered on the topic, is there a principal exception for the epistemic criterion of controversiality? So please welcome Michael.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming along this afternoon. I realise this is an unhelpfully obscure title, but my interest is in how schools should teach controversial issues, and a number of years ago I proposed a criterion for deciding which issues should be taught as controversial and which issues should be taught as settled, and that's called the epistemic criterion, and that's been criticised and objected to by various scholars, and various alternatives have been put forward, and so this paper is responding to one criticism in particular of this criterion for deciding which issues are controversial. So that's broadly what the paper's about. So, by way of introduction, I distinguish two kinds of teaching. Teaching as controversial, which is I also call non-directive teaching, or teaching as settled, which I also call directive teaching. So this basic distinction is going to be really important for understanding what the talk's about. So to teach something as controversial is to teach it without persuasive intent, to present different views on the matter as impartially as possible. So suppose, for example, you're giving a class on euthanasia, that is the practice of ending people's lives when they're in great pain and prefer to have their life brought to an end. And you want to teach that, you might decide that's a controversial issue. Like some people think euthanasia is a good thing and is a kindness to the people who wish to end their lives early, and other people think euthanasia is an outrage and is the taking of human life and it's never justified. So you might decide as a teacher, I'm going to present this as a controversial issue, which means that your job as a teacher is not to persuade your students to think that euthanasia is okay or to think that euthanasia is wrong. It's to explore the arguments on both sides and keep the question open. So your students themselves might come to particular beliefs or views on the question, but your job as a teacher is not to persuade them of anything. So that's what I mean by teaching without persuasive intent. You're not trying to guide your students to one view or another. So that's teaching as controversial. To teach something as settled, on the other hand, is to teach it with persuasive intent. To guide pupils explicitly or tacitly from question to answer, problem to solution. So most school subject teaching is of this kind. It's the teaching as settled. Like with most historical questions, we teach I'm suddenly trying to think of examples from history, and I can only think of examples from UK history that are probably not widely known here. But anyway, we'll say a famous battle in UK history was the Battle of Hastings in 1066, and if you're teaching students about the Battle of Hastings, you teach them when it happened, and it's not controversial, nobody disagrees, we all agree it happened in 1066, and so you just teach the answer to the question. So lots and lots of teaching in schools. We know the answers to the questions we're teaching, so we are just trying to help students understand what those answers are. So that's the basic distinction. When we teach things, we might know the answer and try and teach it. That's directive teaching, or we might not know the answer and trying to keep the question open, that's non-directive teaching. Okay, so then we need to know how we're going to decide what goes in what category. How are we to decide what to teach as settled and what to teach as controversial? In previous work, I have argued that decisions about directive and non-directive teaching should be governed by the epistemic criterion. Here's what that criterion says. The epistemic criterion stipulates that a matter should be taught as controversial if and only if contrary views can be held on it without those views being contrary to reason. So that definition of the epistemic criterion comes from Robert Dearden, who was writing mostly in the 1970s and early 1980s. So it's quite an old definition, but that seems to capture, seems to be right, that seems to capture exactly what we mean by the epistemic criterion. Is it possible, on the issue you're teaching, for people to hold different views and both of those views to be reasonable? So if we've got two people who have different views about when the Battle of Hastings happened, what happened, one person thinks it was 1066, the other person thinks it was 1666, right? One person we know is wrong and one person we know is right, because the historical evidence entirely supports the person who thinks it happened in 1066. So in that instance, even though people might disagree about it, we know what the right answer is. And so in schools, we should teach the right answer because that's where the evidence lies. It's not possible, the second person who thinks it was 1666 does not have evidence or argument on their side. They're just wrong. They've made a mistake. If we look at the euthanasia question, on the other hand, the person who thinks euthanasia policies are bad can produce lots of arguments in support of their position as to why euthanasia is not a good idea. But the defender of euthanasia can also produce lots of good, rational arguments for why we should allow doctors to end the lives of patients who are in great pain. So, on that issue, there are good arguments on both sides. So all the epistemic criterion says is, are there good arguments on both sides of this issue? If there are good arguments on both sides, we should teach the question as controversial. If all the good arguments are on one side, then we should teach it as settled. So that's quite an intuitive criterion, I hope. Also in previous work, though, I've allowed that there are what I call pragmatic exceptions to the epistemic criterion. Sometimes standing on epistemic principle is impractical, counterproductive, or self-defeating. So there were some classroom situations where, even though we know which way the evidence lies, we might decide not to teach the matter as settled, or even though the question is actually open, we might decide to teach it as if it was settled. And I'll say more about what those pragmatic exceptions are. But normally, other things being equal, we should follow the epistemic criterion. The question I want to consider today, though, is, as well as these pragmatic exceptions that I'll talk about in a minute, is there also a principled exception? Is there some whole class of cases where, in principle, we shouldn't use the epistemic criterion? That's an argument that has been made by Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy in a book called The Political Classroom. If you've not read their book, The Political Classroom, I highly recommend it. But they say that when we're teaching political questions, we shouldn't use the epistemic criterion at all. It's just the wrong criterion to use. And they propose a different one in its stead. So the main thing I want to do today is look at their argument for why we shouldn't use the epistemic criterion in relation to political questions, and see if it's any good. Alright, so the talk is divided into three parts. Firstly, I'll say a little bit more about the case for the epistemic criterion, why I think this is the right criterion to use. In the second part, I'll say something about the pragmatic exceptions that I think there are. And then in the third part, I will get into the main question for this afternoon, which is there a principled exception in the case of political questions? Alright, so why epistemic criterion is the right one to use? Well, I take it that a central aim of education is to equip pupils with a capacity for and inclination to rational thought and action. By which I mean that when kids leave school, I want them to be more rational in their thinking and in their acting than when they started. Right, that should be quite easy to achieve, because when kids are 5, when they start school, they're not that rational. But the idea is that the process of education, one of the things we want to achieve is that kids have good reasons for the things they believe and the things they do. So as educators, we do not know what choices our pupils will make in life, what careers they will pursue, relationships they will form, causes they will support, or projects they will undertake. All of that's unknown to us. That's part of their choice, their freedom as adult citizens of the world. What we do know is that they will make innumerable judgments and decisions in their lives, some quite straightforward, others dauntingly difficult. And that making judgments and decisions well is a matter of making them on the basis of good reasons. So it's not our job to tell students what careers to pursue or what relationships to form or anything like that, but it is our job to try and ensure that whatever decisions and judgments students make, they make them on the basis of good reasons. Right? We're teaching them to think clearly and well about their actions and their beliefs. So that's what I take to be a central, if not the central, aim of education. That's the starting premise. Okay, we know that our pupils' beliefs are more likely to be true if they're informed by relevant evidence and arguments. And their actions are more likely to be appropriate or sensible or reasonable if informed by relevant moral and prudential considerations. We know, in short, that their lives will go better to the extent that they think and act rationally. And it seems to me that anyone sincerely committed to this central educational aim has no choice but to adopt the epistemic criterion. If we really believe that the best thing we can do for our students as educators is to help them make decisions and form beliefs on the basis of good reasons and good arguments, then we have to be governed by the epistemic criterion in the way we think about the subject matter of teaching. If we're serious about promoting rationality, we must be serious about teaching pupils to judge candidates for belief against the evidence and arguments in their support. This is not, or not only, a matter of advocating an abstract epistemological principle, it's a matter of presenting pupils with the evidence adduced in support of a claim, helping them to evaluate it, and encouraging them to accept the claim if, and only if, the evidence is epistemically adequate. So if we think of any topic or question that we teach, the idea is that we lay out the evidence and the argument such as we have it, and we help students to see whether the evidence is decisive, it decisively supports the claim or not. So I take it that in good science teaching, this is how we would proceed. Right, we want kids to form the correct beliefs about the speed with which objects accelerate when they fall towards the Earth. And to do that, we show them the evidence. When I was at school, hopefully it's more sophisticated now, when I was at school, you dropped something off the end of a desk attached to a piece of ticker tape, and the little dots went along a little piece of paper, and then you measured the gaps between the dots. And as the object falls to the floor, the gaps get bigger, and you can calculate how rapidly objects accelerate as they fall to the ground. So we get to the right answer, and we understand the evidence, and so we know why we believe that objects accelerate the way they do. Same with historical claims. Right? The claims we teach in history, we should also present students with the source material, the evidence that we have that supports those claims. And where the evidence is decisive, we help students to see that it's decisive and to form their beliefs on the basis of the evidence. Where the evidence is not decisive, we say, so we should keep an open mind, right? In history, often, we simply have two competing testimonial accounts from eyewitnesses at the time that say different things. And then we have to say, we don't know. We have to keep an open mind because the evidence pulls in two different directions. But the idea is, one second, the idea is that we encourage kids to believe where the evidence is decisive and to keep an open mind where it's not decisive. Yes?
Can I assume it's just a fancier version of critical thinking, or they're just the same?
Yeah, so critical thinking is quite a contested and loose term, but yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think if you take an advocate of critical thinking like Harvey Siegel, who says that the critical thinker is someone who believes on the basis of what there's good reason to believe, then that's what I'm talking about, yes. Okay, either to refrain from endorsing claims that enjoy the support of decisive evidence, or to endorse claims for which the available evidence is weak or ambiguous, is to undermine the aim of nurturing rational thought and action. So, if we take something that we know is true, but we pretend we don't know if it's true or not, then we are undermining our aim of enabling children to judge rationally for themselves on the basis of the evidence, because we are not helping them to see that in this case the evidence decisively supports the view. Or similarly, if there's a view which is not well supported by evidence, but we pretend it is, we imply to our students that we know something that we don't really know, then again we're undermining their rationality because we're encouraging them to form beliefs when actually the evidence is not good enough for belief. So, insofar as we're committed to rationality, we have to be guided by evidence and arguments. So that's the argument for the epistemic criterion, right? The epistemic criterion is simply the criterion that best supports the aim of nurturing rational belief and action. Okay, so that's why I think the epistemic criterion is the right one to use, and in my view, it's the right one to use no matter what subject we're teaching, no matter what subject matter we're dealing with. We should be governed by the epistemic criterion. However, I have conceded that there are pragmatic exceptions. So let's consider a couple of circumstances in which we might need to make an exception. Consider the question of how to teach the theory of evolution in schools serving creationist communities. I don't know if there's creationist communities in Hong Kong or China, but in the United States, for example, there are whole swathes of Middle America where a majority of people would believe in a literal creation in 6 days account of world history. We would reject the theory of evolution and believe in young earth creationism. So imagine we're in a Midwestern school in the Bible Belt of the US where most parents of children at the school believe in young earth creationism. Judged against the epistemic criterion, the theory of evolution ought straightforwardly to be taught as settled. It is overwhelmingly supported by the relevant evidence and arguments. So all of the evidence that we have from geology and the fossil record and biology supports the truth of the theory of evolution, and no biologist who has looked hard at the evidence is in doubt about the theory of evolution. So the epistemic criterion says, teach the theory of evolution as settled, as true. But for schools serving creationist communities, where those communities are at liberty to make alternative arrangements for the education of their children, insisting on directive teaching of the theory of evolution may be self-defeating. It may be self-defeating in this sense. The parents might simply withdraw their children permanently from the school and choose to home educate them instead. But if that happens, if all the parents say, we're not sending our children to a school that teaches evolution, we're just going to home educate them, then we've actually made those children worse off, because the chances are the diet of one-sided thinking that they get from their parents in their homeschooling situation will equip them much less well for adult life than what they would get at school. The idea is that school would be at least trying to give them a more rational foundation for their thinking and their judging and their believing than they will get if they are withdrawn from schools and educated only in a narrowly religious home. So in that instance, it might be strategic for the school to say, even though we know evolution is true, we're going to teach it as a controversial issue in our school because we don't want our parents to withdraw their children from the school. So that would be one instance of a pragmatic exception, that we might make an exception just in order to keep the children in school. Another example, consider the challenge of teaching about homosexuality in schools that are operated or sponsored by religious organisations that explicitly prohibit homosexual acts. So now suppose you're teaching in a conservative Christian or conservative Catholic school where the wrongness of homosexuality is assumed or defended by the religious group that is operating the school. Now, when considered on their epistemic merits, arguments for the moral permissibility of homosexual acts fare decisively better than arguments against it. So I've argued in a couple of papers, and in fact in a recent book, that if you lay out the arguments for why homosexual acts should be permitted by society versus why they shouldn't be permitted, the arguments stack up overwhelmingly on the favour of the permissibility of homosexual acts. There is no good reason to morally object to people forming sexual relationships with people of the same sex. So following the epistemic criterion, if that argument's right, then we should teach same-sex relationships and homosexual acts as morally permissible. But if you're teaching in a religious school, even if you know that homosexual acts are morally permissible, it may actually be impossible for you to say that or to guide students explicitly towards that conclusion, because it goes against the ethos of the school that you're working in. So where it is a condition of a teacher's employment that she does not contradict or undermine the doctrines of a religious sponsor, it may be impossible in practice for her to endorse the view that homosexual acts are morally permissible. Both of these cases are very non-ideal, right? Ideally, we wouldn't be teaching in schools operated by conservative religious groups that require teachers to deny what they know to be true. And ideally, it wouldn't be possible for parents to unilaterally withdraw their children from schooling altogether if they don't like what the schools are teaching. But the world we live in is such that we may have to make some compromises. So it may be in situations like this we have to depart from the epistemic criterion for pragmatic reasons. So it is contextual constraints of these kinds that necessitate pragmatic exceptions to the epistemic criterion. That such exceptions are necessary is a regrettable fact about the circumstances in which schools and teachers operate, but it does not cast doubt on the principle that decisions about directive and non-directive teaching are properly guided by epistemic considerations alone. Moreover, where practical constraints prevent teachers from teaching topics as they should, it is appropriate that they retain a sense of disquiet about what they are doing. So where teachers have to depart from the epistemic criterion, I hope they feel uncomfortable about it. Right? They're supposed to feel uncomfortable about it, because they're having to do something that they know, ideally, if they were following their educational principles, they wouldn't have to do. They're having to pretend that something that is settled is controversial, or they're having to pretend that something they know is controversial is settled. And that kind of pretense should go very much against the grain for an educator. But sometimes, in the sorts of contexts that I've described, it's pragmatically necessary. Okay, so that's why we should have the epistemic criterion and why we sometimes need to depart from it. But now let's look and see if there is a principled exception. That is to say, are there whole classes of views for which the epistemic criterion is just in principle the wrong criterion to use? So let us now consider Hess and McAvoy's proposal for a principled exception to the epistemic criterion. Their suggestion is that when dealing with questions of a political nature, decisions about directive and non-directive teaching should be governed by what they call the politically authentic criterion. On this view, a political question should be taught as controversial, not when contrary views can be held on it without those views being contrary to reason, but rather when it has traction in the public sphere. So I'll say a bit more about their criterion in a minute, but roughly, on the view I've been defending, we only teach things as controversial when there are good arguments on both sides. For Hess and McAvoy, we should teach things as controversial when there is significant disagreement about them in the political or public sphere, which isn't the same thing. Sometimes there's political disagreement about things, even though the evidence falls decisively on one side. And sometimes there's no disagreement in the public sphere when actually the issue is not epistemically settled. So what's rationally settled or epistemically settled is not the same thing as what's politically settled. But according to Hess and McAvoy, when we're dealing with political topics, we should go with whether it's publicly or politically settled, not whether it's rationally or epistemically settled. So that's their basic view. Note that Hess and McAvoy are quite content with the epistemic criterion when it comes to the teaching of empirical questions. So when we're dealing with questions of empirical fact, the sort of questions for which you can collect evidence, the sort of questions that the science, the natural sciences and the social sciences deal with, then we should go with the empirical criterion. So they're not suggesting we use their politically authentic criterion for everything. When we're dealing with just factual questions, the epistemic criterion is right. But when it comes to political, normative, moral type questions, then they say we should go with the politically authentic criterion. So Hess and McAvoy recognise that some empirical questions are evidentially settled and others evidentially unsettled, and they think the weight of evidence is what should determine how such questions are taught. They write, an important aim of the political classroom is the development of autonomy, which includes the ability to critically reflect and revise commitments in light of evidence. When teachers treat a settled empirical question as if it is open to interpretation, they undermine this aim by suggesting that students should seriously consider evidence known to be false. So note here that their defence of the epistemic criterion in relation to empirical questions is exactly the same as the defence I've just outlined. Right? We don't help students at all if we imply that a question is open when the evidence actually settles it. The obvious familiar example here, the one they use a lot, is the example of anthropogenic climate change or man-made climate change. Right? The scientific evidence is overwhelmingly supportive of the idea that climate change as a result of human activity is a real phenomenon, even though in the political sphere there are climate change deniers. So there are people out there who don't believe climate change is real. But actually, if we're following the evidence and the argument, we have to teach the phenomenon of anthropogenic climate change as factual, because we know it is, because the evidence settles the matter. So on Hess and McAvoy's view, if we're teaching the science of climate change, we have to teach it as a settled question, even though people disagree about it in the public sphere. So because this is an empirical question, they're saying go with the epistemic criteria. So they're certainly not trying to use their political authentic criteria for everything. Empirical questions, at least, the epistemic criterion is the right one to use. Okay, but the firm epistemic line Hess and McAvoy take on empirical questions like this is abandoned when they come to consider questions of politics. This is what they write. The other kind of issue is what we call a policy or political issue. These policy-political issues are questions about how we should live together. While empirical questions have an important place in decision-making about policy, virtually all policy questions require much more than empirical evidence to example, many policy questions raise important moral questions or need to be evaluated based on a rigorous cost-benefit analysis. And their view is that when we bring in moral questions and cost-benefit analysis questions, we have departed from the sort of terrain that the epistemic criterion can decide. We are no longer looking at factual evidence alone. We're making judgments of value. And because we're bringing in these value judgments, we can't go with the epistemic criterion anymore. We now need some different criterion to decide whether we should think of an issue as settled or not. It seems clear that what distinguishes political from empirical questions for Hess and McAvoy is that answering the former involves judgments of value. So presumably their desire to exempt political questions from the epistemic criterion has something to do with this distinguishing feature. But exactly what is rather obscure. Someone sceptical about the possibility of making value judgments rationally might be troubled by the thought that all political questions would have to be taught non-directively under the epistemic criterion. So if you're a complete skeptic about value judgments, if you just think there's no way of settling value questions, some people just think, let the world burn, other people think, try and be a decent human being and do the right thing, and there's no way of settling these questions, then you might say, well, all value questions would have to be taught as open or controversial. But that would be a disaster. We can't really raise children while keeping value questions open. So that would sort of motivate a departure from the epistemic criterion. But we can't settle these questions rationally, but we need to give children some sort of coherent set of values to grow up with. So we're going to have to choose those values by something other than rational argument. One can at least understand that position, but that doesn't seem to be the position that Hess and McAvoy take. Their view is not that nothing in the sphere of values can be settled. In fact, they have the opposite view. They think that rather a lot of moral and political questions can be rationally settled. But they want us still to try and keep some of those questions open when we discuss them in the classroom. So it's not that they think we don't know anything in the value sphere, so we have to use a political criterion to give us some content. They think the opposite. They think we know way too much in the moral and political sphere. If we just go by rational arguments, too much is settled. But actually, in the political classroom, we want to try and keep some of these questions open, even though rational considerations settle them. And that, I think, is quite a strange view, but I'll try and shed some more light on why they think that. So their worry is that too few political questions would be taught non-directively under the epistemic criterion. This is what they say. The epistemic criterion is quite helpful for deciding whether an empirical issue is controversial, because there are academic standards for empirical inquiry that for some issues are clearly settled. However, identifying reasonableness and unreasonableness about controversial political issues is problematic for democratic education. And, that is me, wants teachers to use standards of moral and political philosophy to determine whether views are sufficiently reasonable. But this is a much higher standard than is used in the public sphere, and would require teachers to exclude discussions of important political issues. So as they see things, if we apply the standards of moral and political philosophy, we will have to regard many normative questions as settled. But that's not how things are generally understood on the ground, in the real world of political decision-making. In the real world of political decision-making, there are live disagreements about many issues that are settled in moral and political philosophy, on their view. And so in order to keep these questions open, we have to use something other than the epistemic criterion. So I think what Hess and McAvoy mean here is is that while some political questions are in fact decisively settled by arguments advanced by moral and political philosophers, most people do not have the philosophical training to follow those arguments. That's what seems to be the problem when they say the standards of moral and political philosophy are too high. We are making too many demands if we say go with what the philosophical argument shows. But if that's right, there's an obvious and puzzling inconsistency with their position on empirical questions. So recall their view on climate change. On the question of climate change, they say, because this question is settled among scientists, we should teach it as settled in schools. The scientific evidence and argument that settle the question of anthropogenic climate change, which Hess and McAvoy believe should be taught directively, are far beyond the ken of most people outside the scientific community. Right, most of us will never understand the arguments that decisively show that climate change is happening, because it requires an understanding of empirical evidence and data that most of us just don't have. We have to take the word of the scientific consensus that this is what the data shows. But then why is it permissible to teach scientifically settled questions directively, but not philosophically settled questions? So if it's true, as Hess and McAvoy seem to think, that in philosophy we have actually settled a lot of these moral and political questions that are still being debated in the public sphere, but that the kind of arguments in philosophy that support them are too tricky for most people, well, why are we operating a double standard? Why are we saying that the sophisticated reasoning of scientists can override public disagreement, so we go with what the scientists say, but the sophisticated reasoning of philosophers cannot override the public disagreement? It seems like there's a double standard in play there, and it's not clear why Hess and McAvoy think that we should not be prepared to take philosophical consensus as decisive when we are prepared to take scientific consensus as decisive. Okay, so they reject the epistemic criterion for political questions, and in its stead they propose the politically authentic criterion. So let me say a bit about that. Having rejected the epistemic criterion for political questions, Hess and McAvoy set out their proposed alternative, the politically authentic criterion, and here's how they characterise that. The politically authentic criterion distinguishes between what is bandied about in general society as a matter of controversy and that which has entered the authentic political sphere of democratic decision-making. Using this standard, political issues are controversial when they have traction in the public sphere, appearing on ballots, in courts, within political platforms, in legislative chambers, and as part of political movements. So what they try and specify in their account of the political criterion is the spaces where issues have to be disputed in order to count as authentically open or authentically unsettled. It won't do for John and Fred to be arguing about something in the pub. Right? That in itself doesn't make something controversial. But if two members of Parliament are arguing about something in print, then that does make it controversial. So they want to say we're going to teach issues as controversial when there is some sort of respectable political disagreement about them, and it's not just people arguing around their dinner table or arguing over a pint. But where there is ballot paper or political platform style disagreement, then that disagreement should be reflected in how we teach issues in school. So the politically authentic criterion is a variation on the more familiar behavioural criterion. Where the behavioural criterion counts as controversial any issue on which numbers of people are observed to disagree, the politically authentic criterion specifies particular settings in which the observed disagreement must occur. So So initially, the rival to the epistemic criterion was the behavioural criterion. The behavioural criterion says, where people disagree about an issue, we have to sort of translate that disagreement to the classroom. If there's any two human beings in the world who don't agree on something, then we must teach it as unsettled in school. Like, that seems a crazy view, because people disagree about all kinds of bonkers things in life. That doesn't mean that educators have to reflect that disagreement in how they teach. So the epistemic criterion seemed like a marked improvement on the behavioural criterion. Hess and McAvoy's version is a sort of modified version of the behavioural criterion that says not just any old disagreement in public will do, but where there's sort of politically respectable disagreement, then that should be reflected in how we present issues in the classroom. But this adjustment does nothing to save the politically authentic criterion from the serious problems to which the behavioural criterion gives rise. Because both criteria substitute observed disagreement for warranted disagreement, with the result that teachers will sometimes be required to refrain from endorsing a view on a matter, even when only one view is epistemically justified. So this is the crucial distinction between observed and warranted. Just because we can observe disagreement, whether it's between John and Fred in the pub, or whether it's between two elected officials disagreeing about a policy question, the mere fact that we see people having a disagreement does not mean that it's a justified disagreement, does not mean that there's good arguments on both sides. Before we decide how we're going to teach that issue in school, on my view, we have to look at the quality of the evidence and the arguments that are being produced on both sides. We can never just take as read, oh, well look, here's two important people disagreeing about something, so there must be good reason on both sides. We have to go with the evidence, not with the observed disagreements, on my account. But on Hess and McAvoy's account, no, don't go with the evidence and the argument, go with where there is respectable public disagreement about an issue, then teach that issue as an open question in the classroom. Okay, so why? Why do Hess and McAvoy think that on political questions, observed agreement is a better measure of what should be taught as controversial than an assessment of the relevant evidence and arguments? Well, it's quite hard to tell, but I think it has something to do with what they understand by political equality. What then is the principle underpinning Hess and McAvoy's exemption of political questions from the scope of the epistemic criterion? It can perhaps be inferred from this short passage. They write, moreover, reasonableness is an aim of the political classroom, but not the only aim. Teachers also want students to learn to treat each other as political equals by deliberating across their political, moral, cultural, and religious differences. So, on their view, the problem with my position is it seems to suggest that reasonableness is all we care about. Right, all that matters for me is, well, what does the reasons show? Let's look at the reasons on both sides, and let's conform our belief to the evidence. But they say reasonableness is only one of the things we care about in this kind of teaching. As well as caring about reasonableness, what we want is students to learn to treat each other as political equals. And sometimes these two things can be in tension. Sometimes we shouldn't just teach the reasonable thing, we should teach the thing that's going to help people treat each other as equals. So while cultivating reasonableness in pupils is an important educational aim, it is trumped in the political classroom by the aim of teaching pupils to treat each other as political equals. Hess and McAvoy then may be tempted by the thought that when we meet as political equals in democratic spaces to work out how we should live together, we must assign equal weight to one another's views. That, after all, is how we proceed in democratic elections. Everyone is entitled to vote, and each person's vote carries the same weight, no matter how great the disparities in political knowledge and understanding among the electorate. So when we're deciding on who is going to represent us in Parliament, right, we don't make that decision by just looking at the quality of the evidence and the argument on both sides. We don't go with the candidate for whom we have much better evidence that they're going to do a good job. Right? Actually what we do is a popular vote. We say everybody gets a say and everybody's vote counts equally. And sometimes that means that we elect people who are disastrous for the country. People for whom there was no evidence that they were going to do a good job, we elect them anyway. Because we're not being guided merely by evidence and argument in our political decision making. We're being guided by the principle that everybody should get a say and everybody should get an equal say. And I think where Hess and McAvoy's reservation about the epistemic criterion comes from is their powerful sense that we need to respect this right of everybody to have a say, of everybody to have a view, regardless of whether the weight of evidence and argument supports one view better than another view. So, on these political matters, we shouldn't just go with where the best arguments lie. We should go with what our fellow citizens deliberating together and voting together and having an equal say what they choose. And so where, in a democracy, there is live disagreement about something, that's why we have to reflect that live disagreement in the classroom, whether we think the issue is epistemically settled or not. So it's easy to see how Hess and McAvoy might come to the view that democracy requires a flattening of epistemic hierarchies, a readiness to give as much weight to uninformed and ill-considered opinions as to informed and considered ones. So just as we let people vote, no matter how crazy their vote is, we still say they should have a right to vote, in the same way perhaps for Hess and McAvoy, even if of the views we're considering, some of them are preposterous, if there are people out there who support those views, we have to reflect that in the way we teach those questions in the classroom. But, if this is Hess and McAvoy's thought, the case for exempting political questions from the epistemic criterion is, I think, less than persuasive. What political equality requires is commitment to the idea that when people in communities make collective decisions about how their lives together should be organised and regulated, they should all have an equal say in those decisions. Right? That's right. I completely agree with that. When we're making collective decisions together, everybody should have a say in those decisions. That's the principle of democracy. It's a good principle. But what it emphatically does not require is a reluctance to think or say or argue that some of the opinions held by members of the decision-making community are wrong. Believing without reservation that all group members should have an equal say in group decisions is perfectly compatible with holding and defending firm views about what should be decided. So the problem with Hess and McAvoy's view is it requires them to pretend to an agnosticism about settled questions in the name of respecting the political equality of all members of society. But democracy doesn't require that. Democracy works perfectly well when people attend to the evidence and see that some questions are actually settled. And the fact that there are people out there who haven't yet realised that doesn't mean we have to keep an open mind about them. They're settled. We just have to try and get these people over here to see that the arguments decisively settle the matter. This is especially true if one favours, as Hess and McAvoy do, a deliberative conception of democracy. Democratic deliberation requires explicit recognition of the various kinds of expertise and specialised knowledge that different members of the polity bring to the table. So in democratic deliberation, if we're discussing a view on which scientists have specialised knowledge, then we should listen to the scientists. Right? Don't listen to Joe in the pub who knows nothing about science and who says all climate change isn't real, it's a conspiracy. We don't have to take any notice of Joe. right? Because these guys have done the research. So we attend to expertise. Where there's legitimate expertise on a topic in a deliberative democracy, we attend to that expertise. Exactly the same applies to rational argument about ethical and political questions. If there are decisive political and ethical arguments in support of some view over another view, then we listen to the experts. And we try and understand what the arguments that the experts are putting forward are. So we can legitimately differentiate between people who know what they're talking about and people who don't in deliberative democracy. We don't have to say that everybody's view is equal. Oh, sorry, I've got an extra thing there that I don't want. I've had to get rid of it. I'll leave it. It requires insistence on the provision of reasons for supporting or opposing policy proposals and close scrutiny of the reasons provided. And it requires unequivocal rejection of bad arguments, irrelevant considerations, groundless assertions, and incoherent views. And that's crucial in education. In education, we must be prepared to say, this is a bad argument. So, if the politically authentic criterion says we have to try and keep certain questions open, even though we know they've been settled by good arguments, well, we have to call out the bad arguments for the other view and say this is a bad argument. This is a groundless assertion. This doesn't make sense. We have to be prepared to help students understand what the arguments show and what the arguments don't show. So, even in these politically contested domains, in the end, as educators, our obligation is to go with evidence and arguments, not with the mere fact that two politicians or two judges disagree about something. Uh-oh. Got stuck there. I might need someone's help to just get out of this. I can't leave my slides on. No, we're okay. It's all right, sorted. Okay. It follows that the best way to prepare children for participation in democratic deliberation is precisely to teach them to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And this implies that decisions about directive and non-directive teaching of political questions should be governed by the epistemic criterion. Hess and McAvoy's argument for a principled exception to the epistemic criterion in the political classroom must therefore be rejected. So I think even in this political domain, even where we are determined to respect the equal political rights of all of our fellow citizens, that doesn't mean that we cannot teach our settled questions that are settled by rational evidence and argument. Okay, that's it. Thank you.